The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Jefferson Middle School, casting long shadows across the worn classroom floors. Students filed into room 204, their chatter filling the space with youthful energy. Among them walked Daniel Martinez, a quiet boy with dark hair that fell slightly over his eyes. He carried his books close to his chest, moving through the hallway like someone trying not to be noticed. Daniel had lived at St. Mary's Children's Home since he was 7 years old. Now at 13, he had learned to navigate the world with careful steps. His clothes were clean but faded, handed down through countless children before him. His shoes had been resolving twice, and his backpack bore patches that Sister Margaret had sewn on during quiet evenings at the home. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front of the classroom, her red pen already in hand. She was known throughout the school as a strict teacher, someone who demanded excellence and had little patience for excuses. Her perfectly styled hair never moved, and her voice could cut through the loudest classroom chaos. She had been teaching for 23 years, and she ran her classroom with an iron fist wrapped in formal politeness. As students settled into their seats, Mrs. Henderson announced that today they would be presenting their weekend assignment. Each student had been asked to write about a special family tradition and bring in a photograph to share with the class. The assignment was worth 20% of their grade, and she had made it clear that creativity and presentation mattered. Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. He had known this day was coming, had worried about it all weekend. While other children at the orphanage played basketball in the courtyard, he had sat in the small library staring at blank paper. What family tradition could he write about? What photograph could he bring when he had no family to photograph? One by one, students walked to the front of the class. Sarah Chen showed pictures of her family making dumplings every Sunday, the kitchen filled with laughter and flour. Marcus Johnson brought photos of his grandmother's famous barbecue gatherings, where 3 generations crowded around picnic tables. Emma Rodriguez shared images of her family's tradition of decorating elaborate altars for Dia de los Muertos, explaining each element with pride. Mrs. Henderson praised each presentation, adding comments and asking questions. The classroom felt warm with stories of love, tradition, and belonging. Daniel watched from his seat by the window, his hands clenched beneath his desk. He had written something, but the words felt empty compared to the rich stories his classmates shared. When Mrs. Henderson called his name, the room seemed to grow quieter. Daniel stood slowly, his paper trembling slightly in his hands. He walked to the front of the classroom, feeling every eye upon him. He had no photograph to show, no colorful images to pass around. He cleared his throat and began to read in a soft voice. He had written about a tradition at the orphanage, where every Friday evening, all the children gathered in the common room. They would take turns sharing one good thing that happened during the week. It was Sister Margaret's way of helping them focus on gratitude rather than what they lacked. Daniel described how even the smallest moments became celebrations, how a good grade on a test or finding a lucky penny could be shared and applauded by the group. Before he could finish, Mrs. Henderson interrupted him. Her voice carried across the classroom with sharp clarity. She pointed out that the assignment specifically asked for family traditions, not institutional routines. She questioned why he had not brought a photograph as instructed. Her words were technically correct, but they carried a weight that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel tried to explain that the children's home was the closest thing to family he had, that those Friday evenings meant everything to him. But Mrs. Henderson continued, suggesting that perhaps if he had put more effort into the assignment, he could have found something more appropriate to share. She held up his paper, pointing out that it was shorter than required, that it lacked the depth and detail she expected. The classroom had gone completely silent now. Some students stared at their desks while others watched with wide eyes. Daniel's face burned with shame as Mrs. Henderson used his paper as an example of what not to do. She spoke about meeting requirements, following instructions, and not making excuses. Each word felt like a hammer striking against his chest. She concluded by giving him a failing grade in front of everyone, stating that he would need to redo the assignment properly. Daniel stood frozen at the front of the room, his paper hanging limply in his hand. The bell rang, breaking the terrible silence, and students began gathering their books quickly, eager to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere. Daniel returned to his seat, mechanically packing his belongings. He could feel the mixture of pity and relief from his classmates, grateful it had not been them standing at the front of the room. As students filed out, some glanced at him sympathetically, but no one spoke. The shame wrapped around him like a heavy coat, making each breath feel difficult. In the hallway, he heard whispers. Some students were discussing what had happened, their voices carrying tones of gossip and judgment. Others defended him quietly, saying Mrs. Henderson had been too harsh. But Daniel heard it all as white noise, his mind replaying the scene over and over. He had tried to share something meaningful, something real from his life, and it had been deemed insufficient, wrong, not good enough. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Daniel moved from class to class like a ghost, answering when called upon but otherwise invisible. During lunch, he sat alone at the end of a table, pushing food around his tray without appetite. The cafeteria buzzed with conversation and laughter, but he felt separated from it all by an invisible wall of humiliation. When the final bell rang, Daniel walked slowly back to St. Mary's Children's Home. The building stood on Maple Street, a large old house that had been converted to serve dozens of children over the years. The paint was peeling slightly, and the porch steps creaked, but it was clean and filled with the sounds of children. For Daniel, it was the only home he remembered clearly. Sister Margaret met him at the door, her kind face crinkling with concern. She could always tell when something was wrong, could read the children in her care like well-loved books, but Daniel simply shook his head and headed upstairs to the room he shared with 3 other boys. He sat on his narrow bed, staring out the window at the fading afternoon light, trying to understand why sharing his truth had led to such painful consequences. The evening at St. Mary's Children's Home followed its usual rhythm. Younger children played in the common room while older ones helped with dinner preparations. The smell of tomato sauce and garlic bread filled the old house, familiar and comforting. But Daniel moved through these routines mechanically, his mind still trapped in room 204, replaying Mrs. Henderson's words. During dinner, he sat quietly among the other children, barely touching his spaghetti. Across the table, 10-year-old Sophie chattered about her day, and 14-year-old Marcus argued with another boy about basketball statistics. These were his brothers and sisters, not by blood but by circumstance and choice. They had all weathered storms of loss and abandonment, finding shelter together under Sister Margaret's watchful care. After dinner came the tradition Daniel had written about, the Friday evening gathering. Sister Margaret rang the small brass bell, and children of all ages assembled in the common room. They sat on mismatched sofas and chairs, some on cushions on the floor. The youngest ones nestled close to the older children, and Sister Margaret took her usual chair by the fireplace. She began as she always did, asking who wanted to share their good thing from the week. Hands shot up immediately. Little Emma, only 6 years old, excitedly reported that she had learned to tie her shoes all by herself. The room erupted in applause and cheers, celebrating this milestone as if she had won an Olympic medal. Emma beamed with pride, her gap-toothed smile lighting up her face. Marcus shared that his basketball team had won their game, and he had made the winning basket in the final seconds. The older boys high-fived him, and even the younger children clapped enthusiastically. Sophie announced that she had gotten an A on her spelling test after studying hard all week. Sister Margaret praised her dedication, noting how she had seen Sophie practicing her words every evening. One by one, children shared their victories, both large and small. Someone had made a new friend at school. Another had finished a difficult book. A quiet boy named Timothy shared that he had finally worked up the courage to join the art club. Each story was met with genuine celebration, each child's joy becoming joy for all. When it came to Daniel's turn, he hesitated. Sister Margaret's gentle eyes encouraged him, but he found himself unable to speak about what had really happened. Instead, he quietly said he had nothing special to share this week. Sister Margaret did not push, simply nodding with understanding, but her expression showed she knew something was troubling her usually participative boy. That night, Daniel lay in his bed, unable to sleep. The room was dark except for the streetlight outside that cast shadows on the ceiling. He could hear the steady breathing of his roommates, but his own thoughts raced too quickly for rest. He kept thinking about the differences between his classmates and himself, about the photographs they brought and the families they belonged to. The next morning was Saturday, which meant chores and free time. Daniel volunteered to help clean the kitchen, hoping that staying busy would quiet his mind. He scrubbed pots with more force than necessary, the hot water turning his hands red. Sister Margaret worked beside him, drying dishes and putting them away in tall cabinets. After a while, she spoke softly without looking directly at him. She mentioned that sometimes the world outside these walls could be harsh and unfair. She talked about how people often did not understand what it meant to grow up without traditional family, how they sometimes made assumptions or judgments from places of ignorance rather than cruelty. Her words were gentle but honest, acknowledging pain without dwelling in it. Daniel found himself telling her everything. The words poured out about the assignment, about standing in front of the class trying to share something meaningful, about Mrs. Henderson's public criticism, and the way her words had made him feel small and worthless. Sister Margaret listened without interruption, her hand still moving rhythmically with the dish towel, giving him space to release what he had been holding inside. When he finished, she set down her towel and turned to face him fully. She told him that his story was valuable, that the tradition he had written about was real and beautiful and worthy of respect. She explained that sometimes people who have never known loss cannot see the family that forms in its wake, cannot understand that love and belonging are not limited to biology and blood. She shared something she had never told the children before. Sister Margaret herself had grown up in an orphanage, similar to St. Mary's, but in a different city decades ago. She understood his pain because she had lived it. She knew what it felt like to be the child without the photographs, without the traditional family stories. That experience had led her to dedicate her life to creating a home for children who needed one. Daniel looked at her with new eyes, seeing not just the kind woman who ran the home, but someone who truly understood his world from the inside. She told him that the measure of a person was not in the circumstances of their birth, but in the choices they made and the kindness they carried. She reminded him that he was smart, talented, and deeply loved by everyone in this house. As they finished the dishes, Sister Margaret mentioned something else. The following weekend, St. Mary's would be hosting its annual community fundraiser. Local families and donors would come to support the home, and there would be entertainment and activities. She asked if Daniel might consider performing something, perhaps singing one of the songs he practiced when he thought no one was listening. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise and fear. He did sing often, but only when he was alone or thought no one could hear. He had taught himself by listening to music on the old radio in the common room, by humming along to songs that touched something deep inside him. But performing in front of people, especially after what had happened at school, felt impossible. Sister Margaret did not pressure him, simply planted the seed and let him consider it. She mentioned that sometimes the best response to being made to feel small was not to hide, but to stand tall and show the world who you really were. Then she handed him the last pot to dry and changed the subject to what they should make for lunch. The rest of the weekend passed quietly. Daniel helped the younger children with homework, played cards with Marcus, and joined a game of kickball in the backyard. But Sister Margaret's suggestion kept circling in his mind. The idea terrified him, yet something about it also called to him. He thought about the songs that had comforted him during difficult times, the melodies that had expressed feelings he could not put into words. On Sunday evening, he found himself standing outside Sister Margaret's small office. He knocked softly, and when she called him in, he stood in the doorway gathering courage. Finally, he told her he would do it. He would sing at the fundraiser. He did not know what song yet, and he was scared, but he would try. Sister Margaret smiled warmly, told him she was proud of him, and assured him that whatever he chose would be perfect. That week at school felt different. Daniel moved through his classes with quiet determination. When he passed Mrs. Henderson in the hallway, he kept his head high even though his stomach still clenched. He avoided her classroom when possible, taking longer routes to his other classes. Some classmates occasionally asked if he was okay, and he nodded, offering small smiles of reassurance. During lunch, he sat with a few other quiet students, people who existed on the periphery like him. They talked about small things, safe things, and Daniel realized he was not completely alone even in the isolation he felt. There were others who understood what it meant to carry invisible burdens, to smile through pain that others could not see. In the evenings at St. Mary's, Daniel began preparing for the fundraiser. He borrowed music from the local library, listening carefully to different songs and trying to find one that felt right. He wanted something meaningful, something that would express truth without requiring explanation. He practiced softly in his room, and gradually the other boys asked to listen. Soon his roommates became his first audience, offering encouragement and honest feedback. Sister Margaret arranged for him to practice in the small chapel attached to the home, where the acoustics were better and he could sing without worrying about disturbing others. The space was quiet and peaceful, with afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows. Daniel found that in this sacred space his voice felt stronger, braver, capable of carrying emotions too deep for ordinary words. The week leading up to the fundraiser felt like watching a storm approach on the horizon. Daniel practiced every chance he could, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each repetition. He had finally chosen his song after listening to dozens of possibilities. It was a piece about finding light in darkness, about belonging and home, themes that resonated deeply with his own experience. At school, something unexpected happened. Word had spread about what occurred in Mrs. Henderson's class, and while some students seemed to have forgotten or moved on, others had not. On Tuesday, a girl named Maya from his English class approached him in the hallway. She told him she thought what Mrs. Henderson had done was wrong, that his presentation had actually been really honest and brave. Daniel was taken aback by her directness and kindness. Maya explained that her own father had grown up in foster care, and she understood that family came in many forms. She said her dad always talked about how the people who chose to care for him mattered more than the ones who shared his blood. Her words planted something warm in Daniel's chest, a small seed of validation that began to counter the shame he had been carrying. By Wednesday, a few other students had also reached out with quiet words of support. It seemed that Mrs. Henderson's harsh treatment had not sat well with everyone. Some students were uncomfortable with how the situation had unfolded, even if they did not fully understand Daniel's circumstances. These small gestures of solidarity meant more to him than they probably knew. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel stayed after school to help organize chairs in the gymnasium for an assembly. As he worked, he heard familiar footsteps and looked up to see Mrs. Henderson entering the gym with papers in her hands. She stopped when she saw him, and for a moment an awkward silence stretched between them. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat and said she needed to speak with him. Daniel's heart raced, but he nodded and waited. She told him that she had been thinking about the assignment and his presentation. Her voice was formal, controlled, but there was something different in her expression. Something that might have been discomfort or perhaps the beginning of recognition. She said that while he had not technically fulfilled the assignment as written, she had perhaps been too harsh in her delivery of criticism. She did not apologize exactly, but she acknowledged that public humiliation was not an effective teaching method. She told him he could resubmit the assignment for partial credit if he chose to expand on what he had written. Daniel stood there, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to tell her that it was not about the grade, that her words had cut deeper than any failing mark. But another part, the part that Sister Margaret had been nurturing, understood that this was likely as close to an apology as Mrs. Henderson knew how to give. He simply nodded and thanked her quietly, then returned to arranging chairs. As Friday arrived, the atmosphere at St. Mary's Children's Home buzzed with anticipation. The fundraiser was set for Saturday afternoon, and everyone had roles to play. Younger children made decorations with construction paper and markers. Older kids helped move furniture and set up tables. Sister Margaret coordinated everything with calm efficiency, making lists and checking off tasks. Daniel felt his nervousness growing with each passing hour. He practiced his song one final time in the chapel, his voice echoing off the old stone walls. The melody felt right, the words meaningful, but the thought of standing before a room full of strangers made his hands shake and his stomach twist. He reminded himself why he was doing this, not just for the fundraiser, but as an act of reclaiming his voice after it had been diminished. That evening, during dinner, Sister Margaret made an announcement to all the children. She thanked everyone for their hard work preparing for the fundraiser and reminded them that this event helped provide for their home, their food, their school supplies, and all the things they needed. She emphasized that each of them was the reason donors supported St. Mary's, that their potential and their futures were worth investing in. Then she mentioned that Daniel would be performing a song during the event. The other children erupted in excited chatter, many saying they had heard him practicing and could not wait for others to hear his voice. Sophie bounced in her seat with enthusiasm, and Marcus gave him an encouraging nod from across the table. The support from his home family wrapped around him like armor, strengthening his resolve. Saturday morning arrived with clear blue skies and unseasonably warm weather. The fundraiser would be held in the backyard of St. Mary's, where tables and chairs had been set up, along with a small stage that some volunteers had constructed from plywood and crates. Colorful banners fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the smell of baking cookies drifted from the kitchen where several volunteers prepared refreshments. By early afternoon, guests began arriving. Local families, regular donors, church members, and community supporters filled the yard with conversation and laughter. Some had been coming to this event for years, watching children grow and move on to adoptive families or independent lives. Others were first-time attendees, curious about the home and its mission. Daniel watched from a window upstairs, his anxiety building as the crowd grew. He wore his best clothes, a button-down shirt that Sister Margaret had ironed carefully, and pants that actually fit properly. She had taken him shopping at the thrift store earlier that week, making sure he had something nice to wear. He practiced breathing slowly, trying to calm his racing heart. Sister Margaret found him by the window and sat beside him on the old cushioned bench. She did not tell him there was nothing to be nervous about because that would have been a lie. Instead, she told him that nervousness meant he cared, that it meant this mattered to him. She reminded him that everyone in that yard wanted to support the home and the children in it, that they were not a hostile audience but potential allies. She shared a story about her first time speaking publicly after leaving the orphanage where she grew up. She had been so terrified that she almost ran away, but someone told her that her story had power, that her voice deserved to be heard. She said that Daniel's voice, both literal and metaphorical, carried truth and beauty and the world needed to hear it. As the program began, Daniel listened to the sounds from below. Sister Margaret welcomed everyone and spoke about the home's mission and needs. Some of the younger children performed a short skit they had practiced, earning applause and laughter. A local businessman gave a speech about community responsibility. The event flowed smoothly, each segment building toward the musical performances that would conclude the program. Finally, Sister Margaret announced that Daniel Martinez would be singing for them. Daniel took a deep breath and walked down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out into the yard. The makeshift stage suddenly looked very small and exposed. Dozens of faces turned toward him as he climbed the creaky steps and stood before the microphone that someone had set up. He looked out at the crowd and saw Sister Margaret in the front row, her smile warm and encouraging. He saw his roommates and the other children from St. Mary's, some giving him thumbs up or excited waves. He saw strangers whose expressions ranged from polite interest to genuine curiosity. And then, to his complete shock, he saw some familiar faces from school. Maya was there with an older man who must have been her father. A few other classmates stood near the back with their parents. His mind reeled at their presence, and for a moment panic threatened to overwhelm him. But then he remembered something Sister Margaret had said about his voice deserving to be heard. He gripped the microphone stand and began. The first notes came out softer than he intended, and he paused, gathering his courage. Then he started again, and this time his voice was clearer, stronger. The song began gently, a melody about searching and longing, about being lost and finding glimpses of light. His voice carried across the yard, silencing side conversations and drawing every eye to the stage. As he moved into the second verse, something shifted inside him. The nervousness began to transform into something else, into a sense of purpose and release. He was not just singing words, but expressing truths he had lived. The lyrics spoke of storms weathered and hands that reached out in darkness. They spoke of home being not a place but a feeling, not walls but hearts that chose to care. Daniel's voice grew stronger with each line, filling the yard with a richness that seemed impossible from such a young person. The melody soared and dipped, carrying emotions that words alone could never capture. He sang about nights when hope felt distant, about mornings that brought unexpected kindness, about the family built from shared struggles rather than shared blood. The crowd had gone completely still. People who had been checking their phones or chatting quietly were now focused entirely on the boy on the stage. Some leaned forward in their chairs as if pulled by an invisible force. Others stood frozen where they had been walking, caught mid-step by the power in his voice. In the front row, tears began streaming down Sister Margaret's face. She had known Daniel could sing, had heard him practicing, But this was different. This was not just technical skill, but something deeper, a soul bearing itself through music. She saw in his performance the pain he had carried silently, the resilience he had built, the beauty that existed within his wounded heart. The younger children from St. Mary's watched with wide eyes and open mouths. They had heard Daniel sing during practices, but now he seemed transformed, almost otherworldly in his intensity. Sophie gripped the edge of her chair, completely mesmerized. Marcus felt his own throat tighten with emotion, pride for his friend mixing with a deep understanding of the feelings Daniel was expressing. Among the crowd, Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her father placed an arm around her shoulders, his own expression deeply moved. He whispered something to her about authenticity and courage, about how rare it was to witness someone being so genuinely vulnerable. Maya nodded, thinking about the boy who had stood humiliated in Mrs. Henderson's classroom, and seeing now the strength it must have taken to stand on this stage. As Daniel reached the bridge of the song, his voice broke slightly on a particularly emotional phrase. But instead of detracting from the performance, that small crack made it even more powerful. It was a reminder that this was real, that these were not just practiced notes but lived experiences pouring out through music. He recovered immediately, his voice swelling with renewed force. An older woman in the third row clutched her husband's hand tightly. She was a regular donor to St. Mary's, had been supporting the home for over a decade, but she had never fully understood the depth of what these children experienced. Now listening to Daniel's song, she felt their reality touching her heart in a way that statistics and donation appeals never had. The lyrics spoke of looking in mirrors and seeing questions without answers, of classrooms where belonging felt like a foreign language, of nights wondering if anyone would remember your name when you were gone. Each word painted pictures that the audience could see and feel, pulling them into Daniel's world with undeniable force. A local journalist who had come to cover the fundraiser for the community section of the newspaper found herself unable to take notes. Her pen hovered uselessly above her notepad as she stood transfixed. This was not the feel-good charity story she had expected to write. This was something profound, something that challenged comfortable assumptions about orphans and institutions and what children without traditional families really experienced. Daniel moved into the final verse, and his voice reached heights he had never achieved in practice. The song spoke of choosing to keep walking forward, of finding light not because darkness had ended but because you refused to stop looking for it. It spoke of love that was earned and chosen, of family that was built rather than inherited, of home being carried in the heart rather than confined to an address. The melody began to wind down, becoming softer and more introspective. Daniel's voice dropped to almost a whisper, intimate and raw, as he sang the final lines about belonging to something bigger than yourself, about being part of a story still being written. The last note hung in the air, delicate and beautiful, before fading into complete silence. For several long seconds, no one moved. The silence stretched out, not awkward but full, heavy with emotion. People seemed to be processing what they had just experienced, unable to immediately transition back to normal social interactions. Some had tears on their cheeks, others wore expressions of stunned recognition. Then someone started clapping, and the spell broke. The applause began slowly but built rapidly into a roar. People stood from their chairs, a standing ovation erupting across the yard. The sound was thunderous, accompanied by whistles and cheers. The children from St. Mary's jumped and shouted their approval, hugging each other with joy and pride. Daniel stood on the stage, overwhelmed by the response. His legs felt weak and his hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline that had carried him through the performance began to ebb. He managed a small bow, his face flushed with emotion. Sister Margaret climbed onto the stage and pulled him into a tight embrace, whispering words of pride and love into his ear that only he could hear. As the applause continued, Daniel looked out at the crowd with new eyes. He saw not judgment or pity but genuine appreciation and respect. He saw people whose walls had been momentarily lowered by his honesty, who had been touched by his willingness to be vulnerable. He saw that his story, the one Mrs. Henderson had dismissed as insufficient, had power when expressed through music. Maya pushed through the crowd to reach the stage, her father following behind. When Daniel finally stepped down, she threw her arms around him in an impulsive hug, telling him that was the most incredible thing she had ever heard. Her father shook Daniel's hand formally, then pulled him into a brief hug as well, telling him he had real talent and a gift for connecting with people. Other attendees approached with similar sentiments. Strangers told him his voice was remarkable, that his song had moved them deeply. Some asked questions about his training, surprised to learn he was entirely self-taught. Others simply thanked him for sharing something so personal and powerful. The attention was overwhelming but warm, supportive rather than invasive. The journalist approached with her card asking if she could interview him for a feature story. Daniel looked at Sister Margaret uncertainly, and she told the woman they could arrange something appropriate, protecting him even as opportunity knocked. The journalist nodded understandingly, respecting the need for boundaries while clearly excited about the story she would write. As the crowd gradually returned to socializing and refreshments, Daniel found a quiet corner with his friends from the home. They surrounded him with congratulations and teasing, the normal rhythm of their relationships reasserting itself. But there was also a new respect in their eyes, an acknowledgement that Daniel had done something extraordinary. Sophie hugged his waist tightly, telling him she wanted to sing like him someday. Timothy, the quiet boy who had joined art club, said he understood now why Daniel practiced so much, that it was like how he felt about painting. Marcus simply bumped fists with him, the gesture conveying pride and brotherhood without needing elaborate words. Sister Margaret watched from a distance, giving the children their moment. She saw how the performance had affected not just the audience but Daniel himself. He stood differently now, with shoulders less hunched, head held higher. The shame that had weighed on him since the classroom incident seemed to have lifted, replaced by something lighter and stronger. Later, as the event wound down and volunteers began cleaning up, Sister Margaret pulled Daniel aside. She told him that she had witnessed something special today, that he had not just performed a song but had given voice to experiences that often went unspoken. She explained that many people in comfortable lives never truly understood what children in their care faced, but today, he had built a bridge of understanding through music. She mentioned that several donors had approached her during the event, moved by his performance and wanting to increase their support for the home. Some had specifically mentioned that hearing Daniel's song made them realize the depth of what these children needed beyond just physical care. They understood now that emotional support, opportunities for self-expression and affirming their worth were equally vital. Daniel listened quietly, still processing everything that had happened. He had stepped onto that stage terrified and uncertain, carrying the weight of recent humiliation and a lifetime of not quite belonging. He stepped off that stage having transformed pain into beauty, having shown a crowd of strangers his authentic self, and been celebrated rather than diminished for it. Sunday morning at St. Mary's felt different, charged with a quiet electricity. The children moved through their usual routines of breakfast and chores, but there was an underlying buzz of excitement. Daniel woke to find Marcus and his other roommates grinning at him, teasing that they were now living with a celebrity. He threw a pillow at them, laughing, the sound coming easier than it had in weeks. During breakfast, younger children kept approaching Daniel with questions. Could he teach them to sing? Would he perform again? Was he going to be famous? He answered patiently, amused and slightly embarrassed by the attention. Sister Margaret watched from her seat at the head of the long dining table, a knowing smile on her face as she sipped her coffee. The newspaper arrived mid-morning, and Sister Margaret called everyone into the common room. There on the front page of the local section was a photograph of Daniel on stage, his face caught in a moment of pure emotion as he sang. The headline read, "Young Voice Brings Tears and Hope to Charity Event." The article described his performance in glowing terms, noting the standing ovation and the visible impact on the audience. The journalist had written about St. Mary's Children's Home and its mission, but she had framed it through Daniel's story and his song. She described how his performance had given face and voice to the children the home served, making their experiences real and immediate for the community. She quoted several attendees who said the event had changed their perspective on what orphaned and foster children needed and deserved. The children passed the newspaper around, reading and rereading the article with excitement. Daniel felt surreal seeing his name in print, his story shared with thousands of strangers who would read it over their morning coffee. Part of him felt exposed, but a larger part felt validated. His experience, his truth mattered enough to be documented and shared. Monday morning at school brought changes Daniel had not anticipated. As he walked through the hallways, students he had never spoken to nodded at him or offered congratulations. Some had read the newspaper article. Others had heard about it from friends or family who attended the fundraiser. A few asked if they could hear him sing sometime, their interest genuine rather than mocking. In English class, his teacher mentioned the article and asked Daniel to stay after class for a moment. When the other students filed out, she told him she had been at the fundraiser with her family. She said his performance was extraordinary and wondered if he would be interested in joining the school choir. Daniel had never considered it, assuming such activities were for students whose lives were more stable, more normal. But she insisted he had real talent and should develop it. During lunch, Maya waved him over to her table where several other students sat. He hesitated, used to eating alone or with the small group of quiet outsiders he had gravitated toward. But Maya insisted, making space and introducing him to her friends. They asked questions about his singing, about St. Mary's, about the fundraiser. The questions were curious rather than pitying, interested rather than judgmental. One girl at the table mentioned that her aunt had been at the event and could not stop talking about his performance. A boy said his parents had read the article at breakfast and his mom had actually cried. The conversation flowed naturally and Daniel found himself relaxing, sharing stories about the home and the other children there. For the first time, his circumstances became a point of connection rather than separation. As the week progressed, something else happened. Students who had witnessed his humiliation in Mrs. Henderson's class began approaching him privately. Some apologized for not speaking up. Others said they had felt uncomfortable but did not know what to do. A few admitted they had never really thought about what it meant to grow up without family until they heard his song. These conversations were awkward but meaningful, small moments of recognition and growth. On Wednesday, Daniel received a note asking him to come to the principal's office. His stomach clenched with automatic anxiety, but when he arrived, he found Principal Morrison smiling warmly. She told him she had attended the fundraiser and been deeply moved by his performance. She said the school was proud to have such talented and courageous students. Then she mentioned that Mrs. Henderson had requested a meeting with both of them. Daniel's heart raced as Mrs. Henderson entered the office, looking uncomfortable but determined. Principal Morrison gestured for everyone to sit, and an awkward silence filled the small space. Mrs. Henderson spoke first, her voice lacking its usual authority. She said she had attended the fundraiser at the invitation of another teacher, not knowing Daniel would be performing. She admitted that hearing his song and reading the newspaper article had given her perspective she had previously lacked. She acknowledged that her handling of his assignment presentation had been inappropriate and hurtful. She did not make excuses, did not try to justify her actions. She simply stated that she had been wrong, that she had failed to see the value in his story because it did not fit her narrow definition of family tradition. She said his performance had shown her that authenticity and courage came in many forms, and she had not recognized or honored those qualities when he stood in her classroom. Mrs. Henderson then did something Daniel never expected. She apologized clearly and directly, looking him in the eyes. She told him he deserved better from his teachers, that the educational system should lift students up rather than diminish them. She said she would be reflecting on how her own biases and assumptions might be affecting other students as well. Principal Morrison added that the school would be reviewing its policies around assignments to ensure they were inclusive of all family structures. She thanked Daniel for his grace in handling a difficult situation and told him that his voice, both metaphorically and literally, had created positive change. She mentioned that several teachers had been inspired by his performance to think differently about how they engaged with students from diverse backgrounds. Daniel sat quietly, processing this unexpected apology. Part of him remained hurt, the memory of public humiliation not easily erased by words. But another part recognized the courage it must have taken for Mrs. Henderson to admit fault, to allow herself to be corrected and changed. He nodded acceptance, his throat too tight to speak immediately. Mrs. Henderson offered to let him resubmit his original assignment for full credit, recognizing now that it had been meaningful and appropriate. But Daniel surprised himself by declining. He said the assignment had served its purpose, had led him to this moment, and he did not want to change that journey. Mrs. Henderson nodded, a flicker of what might have been respect crossing her face. That evening at St. Mary's, Daniel found Sister Margaret in her small office doing paperwork. He told her about the meeting, about the apology, about the strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. She set down her pen and listened carefully, then told him something important. She said that forgiveness did not mean forgetting or pretending the hurt never happened. It meant choosing not to let that hurt define you or limit your future. She explained that Mrs. Henderson's apology was significant not just for Daniel, but for all the students who might face similar situations in the future. By acknowledging her mistake, the teacher had opened a door for institutional change, for broader conversations about inclusion and understanding. Daniel's willingness to accept that apology with grace allowed that door to stay open. Over the following days, Daniel found himself settling into a new normal at school. He was no longer invisible, but he was also not defined solely by being an orphan or by his viral moment of performance. He was simply Daniel, a student with friends and interests, challenges, and talents. Maya and her group became regular lunch companions, and he joined the school choir as his English teacher had suggested. The choir director was thrilled to have him, immediately giving him solo parts in upcoming performances. Other choir members welcomed him warmly, several mentioning they had heard about his fundraiser performance. Daniel discovered that making music with others brought a different kind of joy than singing alone. There was power in harmony, in voices blending together to create something bigger than individual parts. At St. Mary's, life continued with its familiar rhythms, but Daniel noticed he moved through those rhythms with lighter steps. The Friday evening tradition of sharing good things felt richer now because he had genuinely good things to share. He talked about joining choir, about making new friends, about teachers who were working to understand students better. The other children listened with interest, celebrating his victories as their own. Sister Margaret watched Daniel's transformation with quiet satisfaction. She had always believed in his potential, had seen the strength hidden beneath his quiet exterior, but even she was moved by how fully he had stepped into his voice, both literally and metaphorically. He had taken a moment of humiliation and transformed it into an opportunity for growth, not just for himself but for his entire school community. As autumn deepened and October gave way to November, Daniel's life continued to unfold in unexpected directions. The local newspaper article had reached farther than anyone anticipated. A music teacher from the community college reached out to Sister Margaret, offering to provide Daniel with free voice lessons if he was interested. The teacher, Mr. Chen, had been moved by the performance and recognized raw talent that deserved proper training. Daniel started lessons twice a week after school, taking the bus to the college campus. Mr. Chen was patient and encouraging, teaching him about breath control, pitch, and musical theory. He explained that Daniel's natural gift was remarkable, but with training he could develop even greater range and control. More importantly, Mr. Chen treated Daniel like any other serious music student, with high expectations and genuine respect. At school, the winter concert was approaching, and the choir director gave Daniel a significant solo in one of the pieces. During rehearsals, he worked with other students on harmonies and timing, becoming part of a musical community. Some of the choir members started eating lunch with him and Maya's group, expanding his circle of friends beyond what he had ever imagined possible just months ago. One afternoon, Maya invited Daniel to her house for dinner. He felt nervous accepting, unsure how to navigate a family setting that was not St. Mary's. But her father picked them both up after school, chatting easily about music and asking Daniel about his voice lessons. The house was warm and filled with the smell of cooking, photographs lining the walls in mismatched frames. During dinner, Maya's parents asked about his life with genuine interest, rather than prying curiosity. Her father shared more about growing up in foster care, the challenges and the people who had made differences. He told Daniel that seeing him perform at the fundraiser had brought back memories of his own journey, the moments when people believed in him despite his circumstances. Maya's mother worked as a social worker and spoke knowledgeably about the foster care system and the needs of children in care. She praised St. Mary's reputation in the community and mentioned that Sister Margaret was considered one of the best advocates for children in the region. The conversation flowed naturally, and Daniel found himself relaxing, sharing stories about the home and his hopes for the future. As they drove him back to St. Mary's that evening, Maya's father mentioned that if Daniel ever needed anything, help with college applications someday or someone to talk to about navigating life after the system, he should not hesitate to reach out. The offer was genuine and specific, not empty charity but real support from someone who understood. Daniel thanked him quietly, feeling the expansion of his safety net, the growth of his chosen family. Back at the home, the younger children were preparing for an upcoming Thanksgiving celebration. They made paper turkeys and practiced songs for the meal they would share with volunteers and donors. Daniel helped Sophie with her reading homework, listening as she sounded out words with intense concentration. She told him she wanted to be a teacher someday so she could be nice to all the kids, especially the ones who did not have regular families. Her words struck Daniel deeply. These children, despite their young ages and difficult circumstances, were learning empathy and understanding through their experiences. They were growing up with awareness of different kinds of families, different kinds of struggles. What the world sometimes saw as deficits, Sister Margaret was helping them transform into strengths, into deeper capacities for compassion and resilience. The week before the school's winter concert, Mrs. Henderson approached Daniel in the hallway. She asked if she could attend the performance, her tone uncertain, as if expecting rejection. Daniel considered for a moment, then told her she was welcome to come. She nodded, looking relieved, and mentioned she was looking forward to hearing him sing again. The evening of the concert arrived with surprising speed. The school auditorium filled with parents, siblings, and community members. Daniel peeked through the side curtain and saw Sister Margaret in the third row, accompanied by several of the older children from St. Mary's. Maya's family sat near the front. He spotted Mrs. Henderson toward the back, sitting alone but attentive. The choir performed several pieces, their voices blending beautifully under the director's guidance. When Daniel's solo approached, he stepped forward to the microphone, the spotlight warm on his face. Unlike the fundraiser where nervousness had almost overwhelmed him, tonight he felt prepared and confident. The training with Mr. Chen had strengthened his technique, and the support of his choir mates surrounded him like armor. He began singing, his voice clear and powerful. The song was different from the fundraiser performance, more technically challenging, but less emotionally raw. It was a classical piece about hope and perseverance, themes that resonated but did not expose him quite so vulnerably. His voice soared through the auditorium, hitting each note with precision while maintaining emotional depth. The audience responded with warm applause when he finished, and the concert continued with the full choir rejoining for the final pieces. Afterward, people milled around the lobby, congratulating students and chatting with teachers. Daniel found himself surrounded by well-wishers, including several teachers who praised his performance and mentioned they had heard about his fundraiser singing. Mrs. Henderson approached him in the crowd, waiting patiently until others had moved on. She told him his performance was beautiful, that she could hear the growth in his technique. Then she said something unexpected. She mentioned that his story and his music had prompted her to volunteer at St. Mary's, helping with homework and reading to younger children. She said she wanted to better understand the lives of students who came from different circumstances than her own. Daniel did not know quite what to say. The transformation seemed genuine, this teacher who had humiliated him now trying to expand her perspective and do better. He thanked her for volunteering, acknowledging the effort. It felt like a small closing of the circle, not erasing what had happened but allowing growth to emerge from difficulty. Sister Margaret gathered her group to head back to the home, but not before several parents approached her to praise Daniel and ask about St. Mary's. Some inquired about donation opportunities. Others asked about volunteer positions. One couple mentioned they were considering fostering or adoption and wanted to learn more. Daniel's visibility, his willingness to share his story through music, was creating ripples that extended far beyond himself. On the drive back in the home's old van, the children chattered excitedly about the concert. Marcus teased Daniel about being a star, and Sophie insisted he teach her to sing like that someday. Sister Margaret caught Daniel's eye in the rearview mirror and smiled, a look of profound pride and satisfaction on her weathered face. That weekend, Mr. Chen called Sister Margaret with unexpected news. He had connections in the regional performing arts community and wanted to recommend Daniel for a scholarship program for talented young musicians. The program would provide intensive summer training and connect students with performance opportunities. He believed Daniel had the potential not just for local success, but for a genuine career in music if he chose to pursue it. Sister Margaret discussed it with Daniel that evening in her office. She emphasized that this was his choice, that no one would pressure him into any particular path, but she wanted him to know that doors were opening, that his talent and courage had created possibilities. Daniel sat quietly, overwhelmed by how much his life had changed in just a few months. He thought about the boy who had stood in Mrs. Henderson's classroom feeling small and worthless, whose story had been dismissed as insufficient. He thought about how terrified he had been to stand on that makeshift stage at the fundraiser. And he thought about who he was becoming, someone who could stand in spotlights, who could use his voice to create connection and change. He told Sister Margaret he wanted to apply for the scholarship program. He wanted to develop his gift, to see how far his voice could take him. But more than that, he wanted to continue using music to tell stories, to build bridges between different kinds of people, to help others feel less alone. She squeezed his hand gently, telling him she had no doubt he would do remarkable things. As November moved toward December, Daniel found rhythm in his expanded life. School, choir, voice lessons, homework help at the home, Friday evening traditions, meals with friends, practice sessions in the chapel. Each piece fit together, creating a life that felt full and purposeful, rather than limited by circumstances beyond his control. He still had hard days when the absence of biological family ached in ways that chosen family could not quite fill. He still sometimes felt different from classmates who had never questioned where they belonged or who would come to their school events. But these feelings no longer defined him. They were part of his story, but not the whole story, and he was learning to hold complexity without being crushed by it. Winter break arrived with cold winds and early darkness, but St. Mary's Children's Home glowed with warmth and anticipation. The holiday season was always special at the home, with Sister Margaret and the volunteers working to ensure every child felt celebrated and loved. This year, Daniel participated in the preparations with a lightness he had never quite felt before, his heart more open to joy. On Christmas morning, after gifts had been opened and breakfast eaten, Daniel sat in the chapel practicing a new song Mr. Chen had given him. The stained glass windows filtered weak winter sunlight into colored patches on the old wooden floor. He sang quietly, working through difficult passages when he heard the door creak open behind him. Sister Margaret entered, carrying a wrapped package. She sat in one of the pews and listened until he finished the phrase he was working on. Then she called him over, patting the seat beside her. She handed him the gift, watching as he carefully unwrapped it to reveal a leather-bound journal with his initials embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, she had written a note dated that morning. It spoke about the journey she had watched him travel over the past months, from a quiet boy trying to disappear to a young man finding his voice. She wrote about courage coming in many forms, about how sharing vulnerability could create strength, about the power of choosing growth even when life offered every excuse to remain small and guarded. The note ended with words Daniel would return to many times in years to come. Your story is not defined by what you lost, but by what you choose to build. You have shown me and so many others that family is not about blood or circumstance, but about love, choice, and the courage to keep singing even when the audience seems hostile. You belong here, you belong in this world, and your voice matters. Never forget that. Daniel read the words twice, tears blurring his vision. He hugged Sister Margaret tightly, trying to communicate gratitude that went beyond language. She held him for a long moment. This woman who had been mother, teacher, and champion to so many children over so many years. When they finally separated, she told him the journal was for writing down his songs, his thoughts, his stories, whatever he needed to express. Over the winter break, Daniel began writing in the journal. He wrote about his experiences, processing them through words on paper. He wrote song lyrics, experimenting with putting his feelings into verse. He wrote letters he would never send to parents he did not remember, working through complicated emotions about abandonment and belonging. The journal became a companion, a safe place to explore the landscape of his inner world. When school resumed in January, Daniel learned he had been accepted into the summer scholarship program for young musicians. The news came in an official letter that Sister Margaret read aloud at dinner, with all the children cheering and applauding. The program would last 6 weeks and include master classes with professional musicians, performance opportunities, and intensive training in multiple musical styles. Maya congratulated him at school the next day, joking that she would have to start getting his autograph now before he became too famous. Her easy friendship had become one of the constants in his life, a reminder that genuine connection could form across different circumstances. She told him her father was planning to start a mentorship program at St. Mary's, working with older children who were preparing to age out of the system. In February, the local newspaper did a follow-up story about Daniel, tracking how his life had changed since the fundraiser performance. The journalist interviewed him at the home, asking about his music training, his school experiences, and his plans for the future. She also interviewed Mrs. Henderson, who spoke honestly about her own growth and the lessons she had learned about making assumptions and the importance of truly seeing students. The article discussed the broader impact of Daniel's story on the school and community. It mentioned the school's revised policies around family-focused assignments, the increased volunteer interest at St. Mary's, and the conversations about foster care and adoption that had emerged. Daniel's willingness to be vulnerable had created space for broader dialogue about family structure, belonging, and the needs of children in the care system. Spring arrived with warming temperatures and budding trees. Daniel performed at several school events, his confidence growing with each appearance. He also began working with younger children at St. Mary's, helping them develop their own musical interests. Sophie showed particular promise, her young voice already displaying impressive range and control. He became to her what Sister Margaret had been to him, a believing mirror showing her potential. In late April, Mr. Chen arranged for Daniel to perform at a regional music festival, alongside students from multiple schools and programs. The event drew hundreds of attendees, including college recruiters and professional musicians. Daniel sang 2 pieces, one classical and one contemporary, demonstrating his versatility and technical growth. After his performance, several people approached him with opportunities. A local theater director asked if he would be interested in auditioning for their youth production. A college admissions counselor from a school with a prestigious music program gave him information about full scholarships for exceptional students. A music producer handed him a business card, saying to contact him in a few years when he was older. The attention was exciting but also overwhelming. That evening, back at St. Mary's, Daniel sat with Sister Margaret on the back porch watching the sun set over the neighborhood. He told her about the opportunities, about feeling excited and scared simultaneously. He worried about leaving the home eventually, about navigating a world that often seemed designed for people with traditional support systems. Sister Margaret listened carefully, then reminded him that he would never be alone. He had built a network of people who believed in him, who would support him as he moved forward. She told him that St. Mary's would always be his home base, that she would always be there to guide him. But more importantly, he had developed internal resources, strength and resilience that would serve him wherever life took him. She talked about the other children who had passed through St. Mary's over the years, young people who had gone on to college, careers, families of their own. She maintained relationships with many of them, watching from a distance as they built lives. She told Daniel that he reminded her of the strongest ones, the children who took their pain and transformed it into purpose, who refused to let difficult beginnings determine their endings. As summer approached, Daniel prepared for the scholarship program with nervous excitement. He would be away from St. Mary's for 6 weeks, the longest separation since he had arrived there 6 years ago. The younger children were sad he would be gone, but they also took pride in his opportunity. Sophie made him a card with drawings of musical notes and hearts, telling him to sing his best for everyone. The day before he left, all the children gathered for a special dinner in his honor. Sister Margaret cooked his favorite meal, and the table was decorated with streamers and balloons. After eating, the children performed a variety show they had secretly prepared, each doing something special for Daniel. Sophie sang the song he had been teaching her. Marcus read a poem about friendship. Even the youngest children participated, their joy and love filling the old dining room. When it was Daniel's turn to respond, he stood and looked around at these faces that had become his family. He thanked them for celebrating him but emphasized that everything he had achieved belonged to all of them too. He told them that when he sang, he carried their stories with him, that he performed not just for himself, but for every child who had ever felt invisible or less than. He sang for them one last time before leaving, choosing the song from the fundraiser that had started everything. But this time his voice was stronger, more controlled, yet still carrying the emotional truth that made his music powerful. The children listened with rapt attention, some singing along softly, all understanding that they were witnessing something special. The summer program exceeded Daniel's expectations. He worked with talented peers from across the region, learning from professional musicians who treated him like a serious artist. He performed in master classes and showcases, receiving feedback that helped him grow. He made friends with other students who understood the dedication required for musical excellence, who spoke his language of passion and purpose. But he also struggled with being away from St. Mary's, missing the rhythms and relationships that had defined his life. He called Sister Margaret every Sunday, sharing his experiences and listening to news from home. She told him about the younger children, about Sophie's progress with her singing, about Marcus getting ready for high school. These conversations grounded him, reminding him where he came from and who he was beyond his musical talent. When he returned at the end of summer, the children mobbed him at the door, everyone trying to hug him simultaneously. St. Mary's looked the same, the familiar creaky porch and peeling paint like welcoming arms. But Daniel noticed he had changed during his time away. He had gained confidence in his abilities and clarity about his path forward. He wanted to pursue music seriously, wanted to use his voice to create connection and understanding. 8th grade began with Daniel as a known figure at school, no longer the quiet outsider, but someone recognized and respected for his talents. He continued voice lessons with Mr. Chen, participated actively in choir, and maintained his friendships. Mrs. Henderson occasionally stopped him in the hallway to ask about his music. Their relationship transformed into something cordial, if not close. On the first Friday evening gathering of the new school year, when it came time to share good things from the week, Daniel talked about something he had realized over the summer. He said he used to think that not having a traditional family made him less than other people, that it was a deficit he had to overcome. But he had come to understand that his family was right here, that the bonds forged through shared experience and choice were as real and valuable as any blood relationship. He looked around at Sister Margaret and the other children, his voice steady and sure. He told them they had taught him what love really meant, that belonging was something you created together rather than something you were born into. He said that when he stood on stages singing, he carried them with him, their courage and resilience and hope becoming part of the music he made. The room was quiet when he finished, several children wiping away tears. Then Sophie started clapping and everyone joined in, applause filling the common room. Sister Margaret caught Daniel's eye across the space and nodded slowly, her expression saying what words could not quite capture about pride, love, and the completion of a circle that had begun with pain and humiliation, but led to growth and belonging. Years later, when Daniel stood on bigger stages in front of larger audiences, he would think back to these moments at St. Mary's. He would remember the teacher who humiliated him and inadvertently set him on a path to finding his voice. He would remember the song that moved a crowd and changed his life. Most of all, he would remember the people who showed him that family was built through love and choice, that belonging was earned through showing up and being vulnerable and choosing each other day after day. His story became one he shared openly, using his platform to advocate for children in foster care and orphanages, to challenge narrow definitions of family, to remind the world that every child deserved to be seen, heard, and celebrated. The boy who once tried to disappear had found his voice, and that voice carried truth that could not be silenced. A song of resilience and belonging that echoed far beyond the walls of one small children's home on Maple Street.